He was the king of risk, the man who flew over canyons, crashed into headlines, and turned pain into legend. But the real shock came long after the engines went silent. Hidden inside Evel Knievel's garage was something no one expected, a truth he never performed and never meant to share. The garage that no one touched. When Evel Knievel died in 2007, the world mourned a daredevil legend. But away from the public tributes, something far more mysterious remained. His private garage. Located on the edge of Butte, Montana, in a nondescript industrial warehouse, the building had become a local myth. Neighbors claimed they'd seen rare motorcycles wheeled in late at night. Others believed the garage held Evel's most prized possessions, locked away from the world. After his death, no one, not even his closest friends, seemed to know what was truly inside. The mystery deepened as months passed. Estate lawyers, hired to settle Evel's affairs, were repeatedly denied access. The building was padlocked, alarmed, and protected by vague property rights that no one could easily trace. When pressed, the family stayed silent. Evel's son, Robbie Knievel, refused to discuss the property in interviews, and distant relatives claimed they didn't even know it existed. But eventually, the garage was opened, not with ceremony, but through quiet legal procedure as part of settling the estate. Inside the warehouse vault, parked shoulder to shoulder, were more than 30 motorcycles, each covered in a heavy canvas shroud. Dust had settled, but the atmosphere felt suspended, as if Evel had stepped out just moments earlier. Along the back wall, framed photos of stunts never published lined the shelves. Dozens of helmets, some cracked, some pristine, sat arranged by color and brand. On a metal workbench was a set of tools still sticky with oil, laid out with geometric precision. Old racing jackets hung beside jumpsuits never worn in public. A calendar from 2004 still clung to the pegboard, marked with a date circled in red, May 12th. No one knew why, but it was the sense of untouched purpose that gave everyone pause. Nothing had been staged. Nothing was labeled for display. This wasn't a museum or a collection curated for legacy. It was a living space frozen in time. Legal teams began the tedious work of inventory, but they quickly realized something strange. Many of the bikes weren't logged anywhere. Serial numbers were obscured. Titles were missing. Some of the parts didn't even match known production spec. Evel had been modifying machines deep into his final years, quietly, without fanfare or intention to show the world. The deeper they searched, the more surreal it became. This wasn't a collection. It was an archive of obsession, one that blurred the line between genius and mania. If you think the story of Evel Knievel's legacy is wild, wait until you see what's next. Comment with your thoughts on what's been uncovered, and don't forget to subscribe for more unexpected revelations. The bikes that were never seen. Not all of the bikes in Evel's vault were classic. Tucked between the recognizable Harley-Davidsons and Triumphs were strange, almost experimental machines. One in particular looked like a stretched-out chopper fused with aircraft-grade aluminum. Another had a frame so light it could be lifted with one hand, built for speed but never tested. There were bikes missing gauges, bikes with electric ignition systems years ahead of their time, and even one rumored to have been built for a stunt that never happened, a vertical wall climb that Evel abandoned due to safety concerns. None of these machines had ever been seen publicly. They weren't registered, photographed, or documented in any known collection. It was as if Evel had been building in total secrecy, away from the eyes of fans, the press, and even his own family. Some bikes had scribbled notes attached, ideas for modifications, new stunts, or tuning adjustments. Others had name tags taped to the seats, suggesting they were gifts never given or rides meant for apprentices who never came. Each machine told a story, a failed project, a second chance, a silent goodbye. These weren't the showpieces people expected. They were expressions, pure mechanical poetry authored by a man no one really knew. For years, the world had seen Evel Knievel as the ultimate performer, but behind those padlocked doors, he had been something else entirely. A creator, a builder, a man who lived not for applause, but for the engine's roar. But under the shine and chrome were darker truths Evel never shared. We listed gear that still makes sense in this market. Quality, no gimmick, it's all in the description. The wrecks he rebuilt in secret. Tucked away beneath heavy canvas tarps were the motorcycles Evel Knievel didn't want anyone to see. Bent frames, cracked fairings, scorched paint. These were the machines that had failed him, or worse, nearly killed him. Each one bore the scars of a stunt gone wrong, from shattered swing arms to dented fuel tank. These weren't display pieces, they were the wreck, the physical consequences of Evel's lifelong defiance of gravity, luck, and mortality. But what truly truly shocked those who cataloged his garage after his death wasn't that these bikes had survived. It was that Evel had kept them. Not in shame, not as discarded wreckage, but in various states of reassembly. Tools sat beside them. Replacement parts were labeled and sorted. Some frames had been carefully repainted. Others still bore streaks of blood under the clear coat. This was not the act of a showman. This was the act of a man trying to make peace with his past. Evel never spoke publicly about these bikes. In interviews, he only ever mentioned the successful stunts, the records broken, the bones healed. But these machines told a different story. He wasn't rebuilding them for show or resale. He was doing it for himself, as if restoring the wreckage could somehow undo the pain or maybe rewrite the ending. It was the silence around these wrecks that spoke the loudest. Evel wasn't afraid to risk death, but these forgotten machines revealed something far more human. He was afraid to be forgotten for the wrong reasons. Every bolt he turned in secret was his quiet rebellion, not against the world, but against his own failure. The deeper they looked, the more they realized Evel wasn't just at war with gravity. He was at war with the myth of perfection he helped create. And that myth unraveled even more when they discovered what he never dared to ride: the Rocket Harley. He never rode. At the far end of the garage, boxed in by tool cabinets and half-empty crates of spare parts, was a motorcycle like no other. At first glance, it resembled a modified Harley Davidson. Heavy, aggressive, stretched, but a closer look revealed its secret. It had been outfitted with two side-mounted rocket boosters, military surplus from a decommissioned aircraft project. The frame had been reinforced with aerospace-grade alloy. The tires were custom molded to withstand blistering heat. Welded to the side was a plaque stamped with just two words: Sky Gunner. The plans for this machine dated back to the mid-1980s, when Evel was past his prime but still flirting with one final legacy stunt. According to blueprints found nearby, he intended to jump an entire football stadium from end to end. It would have required speeds exceeding 130 miles per hour at liftoff and involved precise rocket ignition timing. There were notes in his handwriting scattered across the document, calculations, sketchy trajectories, and even a quote scribbled in pencil: "If I die, let it be loud." But here's the twist: he never rode it. The bike was fully built, fully tuned, and never even started. It had never touched a ramp, never left the garage. The man who jumped fountains, buses, and canyons left his most ambitious machine to gather dust. Was it fear? Was it wisdom? Or did Evel finally realize that some limits weren't meant to be pushed? This discovery shattered the image of a man who lived without fear. It introduced a new version of Evel, one who thought twice, who aged, who changed. This wasn't cowardice, it was clarity. A final acknowledgement that the man who defied death so many times might not get one more chance. But his secrets didn't stop at the machine. Some were stored on celluloid, footage so raw it had never seen the light of day. The footage he hid from the world. Inside a fireproof safe, buried behind tax documents and race credentials, was a stack of unmarked film reels. Some were dusty, others pristine. All were labeled in Evel's scrawled handwriting with cryptic codes like M12 backup or KC cut all. What was on them had never been broadcast. Not on television, not in theaters, not on any of the documentaries that celebrated or sensationalized his life. What they found shocked even his closest collaborator. Footage of failed jumps, some minor, others violent. Clips of Evel arguing with producers, throwing tools, limping off set. Unfiltered monologues recorded late at night in his workshop where he spoke not to an audience but to himself. "They think I'm fearless," he muttered on one tape. "I just don't show them the parts that scare the hell out of me." There were personal moments too. A reel showing him teaching a child to ride a bicycle. Another capturing Evel practicing speeches in the mirror, visibly nervous. He stuttered, rewound, cursed himself, and started again. This wasn't the smooth-talking icon in the white leather suit. This was the man underneath. Fragile, imperfect, human. The question no one could answer was why he kept it all hidden. Was he ashamed, or did he want it discovered after he was gone? Either way, the footage was a confession, proof that the evel knievel the world knew was only part of the story. Just when they thought they understood the layers of Evel's private life, they came across something that felt completely out of character. Small motorcycles, custom built, brightly painted, and made not for Evel, but for children who would never ride them. Bikes for kids who'd never ride, tucked behind a row row of battered Triumphs and vintage racing Hondas was a corner Evel had cordoned off with plastic sheeting and drop cloths. No cameras had ever been in this space. It wasn't flashy. There were no stunt ramps or chrome displays, just 6 miniature motorcycles no taller than a man's knee lined up in a row. Each one was brightly colored and meticulously crafted. Custom seats, hand-painted fuel tanks, and chrome handlebars made to fit small hands. Attached to each bike was a tag. Not price tags, name tags. First names only. Sophie, Marcus, JT, Allie. These weren't collector items or promotional toys. They were gifts, intended for children who would likely never walk, let alone ride. Medical records, photos, and letters from parents were found nearby, thanking Evel for his promises to deliver the bike. Most of them were dated between 1989 and 1991. None of the letters had been mailed. There was no press release. No tax write-off, no photo op. Evel had done this entirely off the radar. Some of the children had passed away before the bikes were finished. Others had aged out of their conditions or moved away. The bikes remained untouched, as if waiting for a moment that would never come. It was the quietest chapter in Evel's legacy, and possibly the most powerful. For a man whose entire career was built on noise, cameras, and crowds, this corner of the garage revealed something almost sacred. A man who wanted to give joy to kids who'd never experienced freedom the way he had. Not for profit, not for fame, just because he could. And yet, while Evel's emotional contradictions ran deep, his financial ones would soon unravel in even more complex and dangerous ways. But Evel's contradictions weren't just emotional. He had one last message for the company that made him famous. The letter he never sent. Harley-Davidson, tucked away inside a faded manila envelope buried under Evel's old jumpsuits and press kits, was a letter. It was handwritten on plain stationery, the ink slightly faded, the folds worn thin from being opened and closed too many times. Dated sometime in the early 1990s, it was addressed simply to Harley. What followed was one of the most personal, conflicted, and revealing documents found in the entire garage. The letter wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel either. It was honest. Evel recounted the years of mutual benefit, how Harley-Davidson gave him a platform, and he gave them spectacle. He praised the legacy, the machines, and even specific engineers by name. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. He called out boardroom decisions he felt betrayed their shared identity. He accused the company of becoming too corporate, too timid, too focused on merchandise and marketing deals instead of making bikes that could survive a jump across Snake River. At one point, Evel wrote, "We made each other, but you left the table too early." It was the kind of line only he could write, equal parts gratitude and accusation. The final paragraph was scratched out so aggressively that the words were unreadable. Whether he chose not to send the letter out of grace or bitterness, no one knows. All that remains is the silent message between a man and the machine that defined him. Yet the fractures Evel hinted at in that letter weren't limited to corporations. They extended into his personal relationships, and some of them came back with lawsuits that haunted his legacy. Lawsuits he took to the grave. As soon as Knievel's estate began the process of cataloging and distributing his assets, the vultures descended. Former partners, producers, stunt designers, and even mechanics emerged with legal claims, each asserting they were owed a piece of the Knievel empire. Some had contract, others had only verbal agreements or vague email. A few showed up with receipts for parts or hours billed years ago, convinced that Evel's garage held property they had contributed to and never been paid for. It wasn't just outsiders. Even former business associates who had stood beside him during his most dangerous years filed complaints. One case revolved around a documentary project that had been filmed but never released. The footage, they claimed, belonged to them, even though it was locked inside Evel's private archive. Another suit involved a licensing deal with an energy drink company that Evel had backed out of at the last minute. They argued that the motorcycles used in promotional photos should have been returned or compensated. Perhaps most disturbing were the sealed settlements discovered in a drawer of Evel's office. Some were decades old. Others hinted at broken promises, confidential payouts, and non-disclosure agreements signed under duress. Evel may have been fearless in the air, but on paper he had waged a quieter war full of buried betrayals and backroom damage control. To the public, Evel Knievel was a lone wolf flying through fire. Behind the curtain, he had enemies everywhere, and friends who eventually turned into plaintiffs. Still, the greatest twist of all wasn't a lawsuit. It was a single opportunity Evel passed on that could have changed everything. The one investment that could have changed everything. Amid Evel Knievel's personal files was a thin folder, unmarked except for a sticky note that read, "Too risky." Inside were emails, printouts, and a draft proposal for a startup company, one that would eventually become the foundation for smart motorcycle diagnostics used in nearly every performance bike sold today. The company had approached Evel in the early 2000s, offering him a silent investor seat and branding rights. The technology was ahead of its time. Onboard sensors, wireless tuning diagnostics, and adaptive suspension mapping. The founder had admired Evel's legacy and wanted him to be the face of the future. But Evel declined. The reason, according to a margin note scrawled in pen, was simple. Real bikes don't need brains. He didn't believe in computers telling a rider how to ride. He thought the concept diluted the art of motorcycling, replacing instinct with code. By the time the company went public, its valuation had crossed $1 billion. A 10% early stake, like the one Evel was offered, would have made him and his estate more money than every toy line, sponsorship, and appearance fee combined. His advisors reportedly begged him to reconsider. Evel refused. He wasn't in it for the future. He was still fighting to preserve the past. To some, it was the worst decision of his financial life. To others, it was exactly who he was. The last cowboy, too proud to trade his saddle for software. And yet, beneath all the money and machinery, was a father, still trying to say something. The will that was never filed. At the bottom of a rust-stained filing cabinet buried behind stacked tires and unopened crates, they found a sealed manila envelope. Inside it, folded twice and marked with a faint grease fingerprint, was Evel Knievel's handwriting. Raw, unmistakable. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a press release. It was a will, or at least something like it. Dated but unsigned, the document laid out an entirely different vision for the fortune he left behind. Not for his family, not for museums, not for memorabilia auction. He wanted it all. Every bike, every dollar, every royalty check to go into a mentorship fund for underprivileged young mechanics. The language wasn't legal. It was emotional. Evel didn't list assets or percentages. He wrote about kids he'd met, garages he'd visited, and the way a tool in the right hands could change someone's future. He described how lucky he'd been, not just to ride, but to survive long enough to learn. "Nobody ever taught me how to build," he scribbled, "only how to jump. Maybe we should teach the other thing." Yet legally, this will meant nothing. It had never been filed. It wasn't notarized. His official estate plan had been processed years earlier, more traditional, more predictable. This was different. Some say he never intended it to be executed. Others believe he meant to sign it but waited too long. A final act of humility or just unfinished business? No one knows for sure. But one thing was clear. This wasn't about Evel Knievel the legend. It was about Robert Knievel the man, trying in his last quiet moment to leave behind more than rubber and chrome. Just a few feet away from that drawer sat another sealed box. This one addressed to a name he never spoke publicly. Letters to his son. Inside a plain cardboard box marked only with the word Rob, there were dozens of letters. Some yellowed, some newer, all handwritten. They were addressed to Robbie Knievel, Evel's son, and they spanned nearly 2 decades. Some were just a paragraph, others filled entire pages, but all of them were saturated with something Evel rarely showed in life: vulnerability. In these pages, Evel wrestled with the weight of legacy. He talked about the pressure he knew he had placed on Robbie, not just to ride, but to live up to a name carved into the bones of American daredevil history. One note read, "I didn't give you the boots. I gave you the mountain." Another, "You were supposed to fly further than me, but I never asked if you wanted to." There were apologies buried between the lines, half-finished, often interrupted by side thoughts about suspension geometry or weather patterns from old jump days. Evel was trying to explain himself in the only way he could. With motion, with memories, with machines. One letter talked about the fear he never admitted publicly, not of crashing, but of becoming irrelevant. Another warned Robbie to never trust the people who clap the loudest. And another, dated just 3 months before Evel's death, simply said, "Don't make my mistakes, make your own." Many of the letters had never been opened. Robbie, overwhelmed by the inheritance of a myth, had locked them away after Evel's funeral. Now, reading through them as an adult, he realized the father he lost wasn't the same as the one the world watched on television. And in the bottom of that box, something else was hidden. Folded blueprints taped to the back of a note labeled, One last ride. The final stunt plan. It was the kind of design Evel never let anyone see. Hand-drawn on aging blueprint paper, annotated in red ink and folded like a secret map, it detailed a stunt that no one, until now, knew he had even considered. It was more than ambitious. It was madness. The plan involved a modified bike, an elevated runway, a flaming wall, and a parachute escape sequence so intricate it would have taken a team of engineers to pull off. Evel had drawn every measurement by hand. He had calculated speed, trajectory, impact timing, even wind shear variable. He had titled it Freedom Jump, and according to the date, he had sketched it out within the final year of his life. What no one could agree on was what it meant. Some of his former crew members believed it was a performance he never had the strength to attempt. Others whispered that it looked more like a final act, a suicide stunt wrapped in spectacle. The blueprints even included a small envelope attached with a paperclip. Inside was a single line: "If this works, tell them I'm free." It was classic Evel, equal parts mystery and bravado. But it was also heartbreaking because it showed that even in his final years, the man was still trying to defy gravity, still trying to outpace death. He couldn't stop being Evel Knievel, even when his body told him to. He never built the ramp. He never modified the bike, but he imagined it, drew it, measured it, and left it behind for someone else to find. That someone would be his daughter, who entered the garage alone the night before it was closed forever. Stay tuned for more secrets from Evel Knievel's hidden world. Subscribe now and be the first to get the next shocking discovery. What the silence revealed. The noise had faded. The journalists were gone. The estate disputes had quieted. The bikes had been tagged, appraised, and inventoried. What was left was silent. And a single evening when Evel's daughter walked the garage alone, the door creaking behind her as it closed. There were no engines running, no spotlights, no narration, just rows of machines that had once breathed fire, now asleep under tarps and dust. She didn't come to catalog anything. She came to say goodbye. To understand, maybe for the first time, the man the world knew as Evel Knievel and the father she barely knew at all. She walked the aisles slowly, fingertips brushing against cold chrome and cracked leather. On a workbench, she found one of his gloves, stiff with age. In the corner, a Polaroid of Evel as a young man, covered in soot and smiling. There was no plaque, no statue, no shrine, but the air was thick with something heavier than memory. She sat on the edge of a metal crate and listened, not to engines, not to applause, just to the quiet. And in that silence, something became clear. This wasn't just a garage, it was a confession, a place where a larger-than-life man had stored the parts of himself too fragile for the spotlight. His fears, his regrets, his hope that someone someday would understand. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, she just nodded, stood, and locked the door behind her. Not to hide what was inside, but to protect it. And that was the final reveal. Not the machines, not the money, but the silence itself. That's what he left them. That's what they found. As the garage door closes on Evel Knievel's legacy, what other untold stories might be waiting? Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold histories that change everything we thought we knew.